favors movement of sodium into the cell. Now, sodium is a charged particle. It's not going to move freely across the cell membrane, that luminal membrane, because the luminal membrane is made up of phospholipids. So what happens is we have transmembrane proteins here to facilitate that movement. Remember, we call this facilitated transport. It's a passive transport mechanism. Sodium is simply going to move across because there's a gradient, but it needs to piggyback a ride, okay, which it does through that transmembrane protein, that protein carrier. Now, so it's the activity that occurs along the basolateral membrane that sets up the environment that then favors movement along the luminal membrane. Does that make sense? Now, once you move sodium out into the interstitium and its concentration builds up, you establish a chemical gradient that then favors the movement of sodium into the bloodstream. Okay? But it all starts here along the basolateral membrane. If you didn't have that pump activity, then sodium wouldn't be pulled or reabsorbed from the lumen. It's setting up an electrochemical gradient that drives then the movement of sodium from the filtrate. Now, these transmembrane proteins that line the luminal membranes of the cells of the renal tubule, these are often either symporters or antiporters. Okay. In this case, this protein carrier for sodium is also concomitantly transporting glucose. Okay? In fact, it's moving two substances, therefore, in the same direction. Therefore, it's called a symporter. Now, it's moving glucose, actually. Glucose is accumulating within the cell. It's moving glucose against its concentration gradient. So this secondary transport of glucose has to be an active transport mechanism. Okay? It means it requires energy. Well, energy is being provided here by this pump. So we call this secondary active transport. Although ATP isn't utilized here at the surface, at the lumen, it's being utilized over here, and it's creating the environment that moves sodium. And if it can move sodium, it has a second receptor for glucose that it can carry with it against glucose's concentration gradient. That's called, if you see down here with the dashed line here, that's secondary active transport. Okay. Now, all of these symporters, there are plenty of symporters for sodium, meaning that they're going to carry sodium along its electrochemical gradient. But all of these symporters then that are carrying a second substance or third substance, okay, they are specific for that second or third substances. Some of these symporters are specific for glucose. Some of them will be specific for a particular amino acid or some other ion, like chloride. They're all very specific. So there are plenty of carriers for sodium, okay? But in terms of other substrates that are present within the filtrate, the number of carriers for them are somewhat limited. Okay? So excluding sodium, there's a transport maximum for every substance that's actively reabsorbed. Whether it be glucose or amino acids, there's going to be a limit in terms of the number of carriers or symporters available for that second substrate. We use the term Tmax, transport maximum, okay, measured in milligrams per minute, to reflect the maximum amount that can be reabsorbed with that particular substrate. And it's a reflection of the number of carriers within the brush border of the PCT that are available to transport that substance. Let's give an example. We said that we freely filter glucose. Well, if our glucose concentration is 90 milligrams per deciliter, okay, then its concentration within the filtrate is going to be 90 milligrams per deciliter, and that's way below the transport max for glucose. There are plenty enough symporters to reabsorb all of the glucose that then reaches the PCT. And So here we see the transport of glucose back into the bloodstream such that none appears more distally within the tubule. And so we're not going to see any glucose within the lumen. Okay. Now, as glucose concentrations begin to climb, let's say we go from 90 to 200 milligrams per deciliter. 200 milligrams per deciliter, okay, is still below the transport maximum. Or some people will call this the plasma threshold for glucose. In other words, at that concentration, even if there's free filtration, the amount of glucose that's filtered is still below the maximal capacity to reabsorb. So even though we see more glucose particles, everything gets reabsorbed, and no glucose appears in the urine. Now, if glucose levels continue to climb, and we filter more glucose, and we exceed the transport maximum, or the plasma threshold, let's say it's above 250, it's 300. Now we have so much glucose that it exceeds the transport maximum. It exceeds the number of carriers available for reabsorption of glucose. Now, glucose is going to be maximally reabsorbed, but there's still going to be some that escapes reabsorption and appears more distally within the renal tubule, and it ends up within the urine. That plasma threshold is around 250 milligrams per deciliter. If the glucose within the plasma climbs above that, glucose is going to begin to spill into the urine. Yeah.
Is that bad?
Is that bad? Yeah, because high levels of glucose can be damaging to the kidneys. But in addition, it's going to cause some problems. And we'll talk about that in just a minute.
I didn't know if you mentioned
No, we'll talk about it. When we screen for diabetes, you know, the other day I mentioned urine dipsticks, didn't I?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that I hadn't had some. Hold on. I brought a couple of urine dipsticks here. This is what a urine dipstick looks like. You can see there are a lot of color indicators that are present. Okay, so you can dip this in the urine and then wait a prescribed period of time and compare the change in color to this chart here and determine if these various substances are beginning to appear in the urine. So there's one color indicator, for instance, for glucose. Okay? And you can determine the amount of glucose within the urine by just comparing the color change to this chart. Now, is a urine dipstick, in other words, a urine glucose level, a good way to screen for diabetes?
Yes.
No, it's not very sensitive. You could have
Say something.
you could have no evidence of glucose in the urine, but still be diabetic. Because as long as you're below the plasma threshold, the T max, then your serum glucose level will be high, but no glucose will appear in the urine. Now, if you have glucose in the urine, it's very specific for diabetes. It means that you probably have diabetes, but it's not very sensitive. It's not a sensitive test for diabetes, meaning that you could be diabetic and still have a negative test. So a better test would be what? A blood glucose. What's called a CBG, a capillary blood glucose level. Now, someone who has uncontrolled diabetes, oftentimes we say they have the 3 P's of diabetes, and the polys. Polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. We've talked about this already, huh? Did we talk about this?
Oh, that don't count. God. That don't count, yeah, okay.
Okay. they start peeing a lot. Why is it that they develop polyuria? Well, this high concentration of glucose acts like an osmotic diuretic. That high concentration of glucose holds on to water. So it drags the water with it so that less water gets reabsorbed. Okay? So it's holding on to water and it's carrying that water into the urine. So you pee more. We call it polyuria. In fact, you can start to become dehydrated because you lose so much water. So what's going to happen is that's going to trigger activation of osmoreceptors within the body. Osmoreceptors sense the loss of water. Okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to trigger activation of the thirst center within the hypothalamus. So as you become dehydrated through loss of water, through polyuria, you start to develop an increase in thirst and you start drinking more fluid. That's called polydipsia. So they're peeing a lot, they're drinking a lot, and then the third P is polyphagia. Polyphagia means they're eating a lot. Why? Because without insulin, or in the face of insulin resistance, you can't move glucose from the blood into cells. So the cells are actually starving, even though you're eating. They're releasing little chemical messages that travel up to the hypothalamus and says, we're hungry. You know, so you're activating the hunger center and you're eating a lot. The problem is that you're still starving because that glucose, that fuel's not reaching the cells. What's happening to that fuel? You're peeing it off. So it's kind of wasted calories. So those are the three P's that are characteristic of uncontrolled diabetes.
So that's why some people have to take the insulin?
Yes, they have to be able to move glucose into cells.
So why is it that, like, what's the difference between type 1 and type 2?
Type 1 is an absence of insulin. Your pancreas isn't producing it. In type 2, you're producing insulin, but the cells are resistant.
Okay, and which is worse?
Well, I think they're both bad, but I think in my mind, 1 is worse because it tends to occur early in life. And so you're saddled with it for a longer period of time where it can do damage. It's also tough to control diabetes when you're a kid. My best friend had diabetes. And he just, you know, if we went out to do something fun or he'd eat ice cream or he'd do whatever the other kids were doing, he really didn't have the discipline to stick to a diet.
So you'd be shoot, yeah. Did he like shoot his?
Yeah, yeah, the
before he eats
that's
something?
right. Yeah, he learned how to do
That's
that.
what friend can do.
Now, I'm going to show you here again a segment of the PCT. We know it's the PCT because we're seeing the brush border along the luminal membrane of the cell. Some of these transporters are not symporters, but look, they're antiporters. They're moving substrates in opposite directions. Again, these symporters and antiporters tend to move sodium and something else. In this case, the cells are responsible for secretion of hydrogen. Okay, so hydrogen is being secreted into the lumen. You're familiar with this formula where hydrogen within a filtrate will react with bicarb, forming carbonic acid, which dissociates into water and CO2. Okay? That CO2 is lipophilic. It can easily cross this luminal membrane into the cell, and the reaction within the cell can move in the opposite direction. CO2 can react with water and form carbonic acid that dissociates into hydrogen bicarb. And then this transporter, as it transports sodium in, it can then secrete the hydrogen so that our body can get rid of hydrogen. All right, through this transport mechanism. So some of these protein carriers serve as symporters, some, as in this example, serve as antiporters. Early on when we talked about the kidneys, we said that kidneys help to regulate acid-base balance. So here, in the face of an acidosis, the kidneys would get rid of extra hydrogen in this way. Okay. Now, we just showed the PCT. As that that PCT crosses the base of the pyramid, okay, it's going to give rise to the thin descending limb of the loop family. It's called the thin descending limb because instead of having simple cuboidal epithelium, it's got a simple squamous epithelium. That's what's in like that. Okay? So we transition, the epithelium transitions from simple cuboidal to simple squamous. And this simple squamous epithelium has channels for water. Okay? A channel for water is called an aquaporin. It's got channels for water, aquaporins. But it has very few membrane proteins, otherwise serve as channels or transport carriers for sodium or other solutes. So as the filtrate is moving down the thin descending limb of the loop family, water is free to undergo reabsorption. But we don't have the membrane proteins to reabsorb solutes like sodium and chloride. And so what happens is, as the filtrate passes down toward the renal papilla, more and more water gets reabsorbed, leaving behind solute. So what do you think happens to the solute concentration as we move deeper and deeper into the medulla? It increases. It increases. Here's what happens. If you were to take a sample of this fluid, let's say it has 10 molecules of the solute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? And then you would take a sample down here, you'd have the same number of solute molecules, but dissolved in less water. So that means that the concentration would be higher down here than it would up here. Okay? Now, another term for the concentration, the sum of the concentration of all the different solutes, is